title of my talk is The Unholy Marriage, Symphonia Gone Wrong. And being mindful of the admonition given to all of us by Father John Baer in his presentation, I would like to qualify that when I talk about the Russian Orthodox Church, I am talking about the administrative structure that functions in the Russian state. And so all the references to it should be interpreted thus. I would like to begin with reminding everyone that the story du jour, the scandal of the outright support of the scorched earth war against Ukraine by the Russian Orthodox Church in the persons of its patriarch, most of his bishops, scores of its clergy, and the majority of its faithful, did not begin in February of 2022 or in March of 2014. The modern historical roots of this horror lie in the choice made by Patriarch Alexei II and the then Synod of the Russian Church shortly after the fall of the communist regime and the ostensible liberation of the Church, to align its destiny, its politics, and its financial interests with those of the Russian government. As George Weigel points out in his recent astute article, A Path Not Taken, as the Soviet Union was crumbling in 1990, two roads metaphorically diverged in a Russian wood. One was the path of national renewal facilitated by an evangelically vibrant, intellectually open, and ecumenically engaged Russian Orthodoxy. The other was the more familiar road of Russian Orthodox subservience to state power. In this instance, the road less traveled by was not taken. And confirming the poet's insight, that choice indeed made all the difference. Indeed, one can argue that the Sergionist Church, born out of the pact with the devil made by Patriarch Sergei Strogorodsky and his greatly decimated synod, had no internal spiritual wherewithal for a different choice. That the bishops carefully groomed by the iron hand of the Communist Party Committee for the Religious Affairs and KGB, all of whom had code names in the KGB system. And here I would refer you to a very well-researched essay by Father Viktor Potapov, Молчанием предается Бог, God is betrayed by silence, could not lead the Church out of its spiritual capacity to the state. Be as it may, with many other contributing factors also at play, money and power chief among them, the choice was made. And that choice proved very lucrative to the Russian Church. It has been steadily gaining back its tremendous property expropriated by the Bolsheviks. It has received access to the rich golden vein of the 1990s commerce via the duty-free exports of goods, especially cigarettes and alcohol. And most importantly, it has essentially been set up to replace the communist ideology in the public sphere. Orthodox schools, Orthodox camps, Orthodox army chaplains, Orthodox faculties in secular universities, etc. The state did its job, but in promoting Orthodoxy as faithfully as it could in the chaos of the 1990s ideological wilderness. Of course, all this came with a price. The Church had to play its part in being the ideological bulwark of the new Russia, which as early as the late Yeltsin years began to define itself as holy and mighty Russia in spiritual opposition to the corrupt West. I have been told by trustworthy sources in the Patriarchate that when the talk of the government of the city of Moscow rebuilding the Cathedral of Christ the Savior had started, Patriarch Alexei asked whether the money could instead be invested in rebuilding some of the destitute church properties where parishes or monastic communities were truly struggling. Here is tipped and clear and unequivocal, don't even think about it. Because the personal ambition of the powerful Mayor Lushkov required the building of the statue of the major patriotic cathedral of the former empire. And of course, the Church acquiesced. It acquiesced also to restoring the unabashedly militaristic iconography. And it got out of the deal the ostentatious hall for the great church councils in the pediment of the new cathedral, which has been a lucrative space used for all kinds of secular and semi-secular activities, including some borderline obscene dance performances by church dancers. One can also recall that the rise of various Orthodox patriotic organizations, and especially significant efforts put into the quasi-military education of the young boys and men, especially orphans, by such figures as the notorious Moscow priest, the late Father Dmitry Smirnov, as well as more nefarious quasi-military Orthodox groups of young men organized to keep order and peace in various Russian cities and towns. I knew a couple of young men who had left those groups because of what they described as their unmistakably fascist bent. Those groups promoted as traditional Orthodox values, machismo, homophobia, practical on-the-ground misogyny, and unquestioning obedience to their leaders. However, I must note that during the times of Patriarch Alexei II, the significant power gained by the Church was largely utilized to deal with internal affairs, including the consistent solidification of the single order at the expense of various fringe groups, especially more progressive movements, and to use the massive support of the state to cement the position of the Orthodox Church as the primary Christian religious institution of Russia. One can point to many legislations limiting the activities of other Christian denominations, from Roman Catholics to Protestants and breakout Orthodox groups, not in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. The outward cruel persecution, including criminal persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, didn't start until much later, but the soil has been well seeded. Still, perhaps the most significant action of the Russian Orthodox Church on behalf of the Russian regime was its role in bringing back into the fold Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. I will not belabor the point which has been so eloquently discussed by Elena Zizulin, and is also a very painful subject to many people here. I will only say that it was an utterly political project by the Russian government to regain its foothold in the West and to gather the Russian world, and that the Church aided and abetted in its success. Other than this not insignificant event, outwardly things have changed noticeably with the election of Patriarch Kirill, just as they changed visibly with the succession of Vladimir Putin presented to the astonished world by the alien President Yeltsin. First and foremost, for all the rumored disagreements between Putin and Patriarch Kirill, they understand each other very well, because they are men of very similar formation. It is perfectly obvious to anyone who grew up in the Soviet Union like I did, and has ever heard Patriarch Kirill speak. He speaks like a Soviet bureaucrat on the Soviet party podium. For all his shortcomings, Patriarch Alexei Mikhailovich Rydiger was a descendant of Baltic nobility and grew up in a non-Soviet Estonia in the proud white Russian immigrant church, although he ultimately betrayed its legacy. In contrast, Patriarch Kirill, who started his life as Vladimir Mikhailovich Gundyaev, although a son and grandson of priests, was entirely a clergyman of the Soviet formation. He is essentially nothing but a Soviet functionary, albeit a church functionary. He has been formed as a chinovnik of the church. It is not for nothing that Putin likes to point out that Patriarch Kirill's father baptized him, an unsubstantiated and unlikely claim. Those men may not always pursue the same ends, but they certainly understand each other and work well in accord. The lack of time forces me to skip over many significant landmarks in the development of the active ideological support by the Russian Orthodox Church for Putin's regime under Patriarch Kirill. But I would like to point out just several important items before getting to the painful issue at hand. First would be the doctrine of the Russian world, as officially introduced and discussed at the Global Russian People's Council in 2007, where the Patriarch was the official chair. Its authors, a group of nationalist intellectuals, were essentially the leading Russian nationalist conservative thinkers. And the significant detail is that in declaring the absolute value of Russia's leadership in the world, where the Anglo-Saxon project has failed, I quote, it makes various pronouncements pronouncements in support of the military defense, including preemptive operations for the whole Russia. This doctrine has been thoroughly repudiated by the international group of leading Orthodox theologians shortly after the beginning of the current Russian invasion into Ukraine as essentially fascist. Its impact on the illogical program of the Russian Orthodox Church, however, cannot be overestimated. In the spring of 2011, Archpriest Vsevolod Chaplin, at that time chair of the Patriarchate's Department of Relations between Church and Society, published a document entitled 5 Postulates of the Orthodox Civilization. This remarkable document, a bona fide fascist declaration, deserves special attention since at the time, Chaplin was one of the chief official speakers of the Moscow Patriarchate and was widely understood in society to be the mouthpiece of the Patriarch. Those postulates go as follows. 1. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, quote from Matthew 6:33. 2. The society and ideally the state must have a spiritual mission. 3. The church, the people, and the state are one whole. 4. Strong central authority is called to consult the people. 5. A person is called to live in harmonious unity with the people. In his repudiation of the fascist anti-Christian essence of this document, Daniel Struve quotes an important passage which underscores both Chaplin's and, as history shows us, the Patriarchate's position. Sacrificing, and this is the direct quote, sacrificing one's own and in the situation of defending the faith and the fatherland, even another's life, self-denial, surrendering one's rights, freedoms, and property for the sake of one's neighbor, one's community, and one's people is the behavioral norm for an Orthodox Christian. Struve correctly notes that in this doctrine, Chaplin essentially commits the sin of the Grand Inquisitor, establishing the ideology of the Church without Christ, where Christ is replaced by the fatherland. The end of 2011, following the widespread popular protests in Russia against the falsification of the national election results, Chaplin published a political program for the preservation of no less than the Russian national sovereignty. The idea was that any form of internal discontent would be eagerly exploited by the external enemy to destroy Russia. The idea exploited by each and every dictator in the world, and certainly championed by Vladimir Putin for the duration of his rule. This program was significantly more radical than the 5 postulates, in that it openly called for the nationalist government program and mobilizing the masses around it, strengthening of the military, implementation of the police repressions against the migrants and quote-unquote corrupt businessmen, etc. In other words, Chaplin was not only signaling the Church's support for the government crackdown on the protests, but calling for even more far-reaching measures. At the same time, in the wake of this crackdown, Patriarch Kirill delivered his infamous obsequious addition to address in which he famously lauded Putin for working as hard for the good of the Russian nation as a galley slave. The next landmark event in the active cooperation between the Russian Church and the Russian regime came in a couple of months in the form of the Pussy Riot case. The punk prayer video by the notorious feminist group filmed at Christ the Savior Cathedral and calling for the Theotokos to drive Putin out of power has provoked an unprecedented joint response, cleverly fueled by both the state-run and the Orthodox media. Among the calls for all manner of cruel retribution for the impious whores, including some Orthodox suggesting corporal punishment and gang rape, Emily, the Church organized a Standing in Faith rally against the Christ the Savior Cathedral, an astonishing and ominous display of hundreds of priests in blood-red vestments conscripted to stand in military-like formation. While the outrage against the performance has been masked as the offending the feelings of the faithful and swept and swayed even many of the progressive Orthodox. The organized reaction of the church at the performance targeting Putin and his regime left little room for doubt about what was really happening. The trial and sentencing of two of the performers will go down in history as one of the most embarrassing spectacles of the church's obsequiousness to the state. From the caricature witnesses to the crime of the barely coherent public persecutor ineptly invoking the canons of the ecumenical councils, and a persecutor, I must note, coached by the previously mentioned Father Dmitry Smirnov, the process was a never-ending embarrassment. It is, of course, worth mentioning that the Russian Orthodox Church has never officially interceded for the accused in any meaningful form, and was apparently quite content with the cruel outcome of the trial, sentencing the two young women, one of whom a recent mother, to 2 years in penal colony. The next important example of the hand-in-hand collaboration of the church and state was the infamous law of Dima Yakovlev, prohibiting the adoption of Russian orphans into the West. In spite of the atrocious conditions in the Russian orphanages being common knowledge, and the fact that Western adoptive parents tended to adopt a large percentage of children with significant health problems, most of whom had little chance of survival, let alone a decent life in Russia, the Church enthusiastically joined the campaign to direct the public opinion in favor of the law. It has spread outrageous rumors of the harm done to the Russian adoptees by their Western parents and upheld the hysteria of retaining the children's ties to their motherland. Finally, the official representatives of the Patriarchate declared the Russian Orthodox Church's unequivocal support for the law at the official meeting in the Kremlin at the wake of its signing. Finally, I must mention the significant support of the Russian Orthodox Church for the law decriminalizing many types of domestic abuse. Patriarchal Commission for the Defense of the Family, headed by the same late Father Dmitry Smirnov, became a staunch ally to the government in the overhauling of the domestic abuse law. They tirelessly spread the propaganda among the faithful that the strengthening of protection from domestic abuse was a Western/liberal ploy to weaken and even destroy the traditional family and challenge the divinely established family order. And this brings me to the subject of the direct complicity of the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia's war against Ukraine. First, let me remind you that this complicity did not begin in February of 2022. The cooperation between the Russian Church and the Russian government to subjugate the Ukrainian yearning for independence is an ancient affair, going back centuries, but its modern period proved to lead to the greatest bloodshed so far. Lack of time prevents me from outlining the many steps in which Moscow Patriarchate has worked in concert with the Kremlin to retain control of the Ukrainian Church and the Ukrainian people. But the most active period began with the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14, the annexation of Crimea, and of course the subsequent granting of autocephaly to the Church in Ukraine by the Patriarchate of Constantinople in 2018. While the autocephaly unleashed the most vitriolic and outright demonic rhetoric from Moscow toward Ukraine, as well as the unilateral breaking of communion with Constantinople, it is worth noting that the Moscow Patriarchate has been consistent in lending its spiritual gravitas to the annexation of Crimea as the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy, the cradle that since has been moved to Kiev in accordance with Kremlin's geopolitical focus. It has also been fully consistent in demonizing not only the autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox, but also Ukrainian Greek Catholics, derisively called Uniates. And the champion of the latter subject is Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev, who can barely let a speech happen without a jab at the nationalist Uniates and Constantinople schismatics. In the months leading to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both the state and the Orthodox media have been ratcheting up their anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, decrying the licentiousness of the westernized independent Ukraine, the crimes of the mythical Ukrainian Nazis, describing the suffering of the innocent of Donbass at the hands of the Ukro-fascists, and calling for the intervention of the Russian state on behalf of their suffering brothers and sisters. Namely, the notorious Kremlin loyalist priests Andrei Tkachев, Artemy Vladimirov, and Andrei Novikov have been telling story upon hair-raising story from the AMBO. It is worth noting that one of the consistent themes of the stories, as well as the accompanying speeches by the Patriarch, is the horror of gay parades that are part of life of the ungodly Western societies. The other one is the black market that ostensibly operates in Ukraine, supplying human organs of the innocents slaughtered in Donbass to the West. In case you didn't know what you could benefit from. The success of the implantation of these outrageous lies in the minds of the Russian people is apparent not only in the high statistical numbers of their support for the war, but the innumerable repetitions in social media, including, if not outright dominant, in the Orthodox social media. And no, we cannot ascribe all this to the paid trolls. These are real people. In the almost 4 months since the beginning of the invasion, Patriarch Kirill, as well as many of the local bishops, to say nothing of the clergy, have regularly spoken up to express their unequivocal and enthusiastic support of the war and the bloodshed. Their rhetoric has not been tempered by the uncovering of the horrific crimes perpetrated by the Russian occupants in Bucha, Borodyanka, Irpin, Mariupol, etc. If anything, it is getting shriller. Permit me to quote some of their statements with dates. Patriarch Kirill. In the Donbass, there is rejection, a fundamental rejection of the so-called values that are offered today by those who claim world power. Today, there is such a test for the loyalty of this government, a kind of path to the happy world, the world of excess consumption, the world of visible freedom. Do you know what this test is? The test is very simple and at the same time terrible. This is a gay parade. We have entered into a struggle that has not a physical but a metaphysical significance. This is from his sermon on Forgiveness Sunday on March 6th of this year. Today, two brotherly peoples have joined the conflict, but they're essentially one, Russian people. Rus is one country, one people, but these people turned out to be too strong, and the neighbors, frightened of this power, started doing everything to divide these people, to convince parts of these people that they were not one people. Sermon on March 9th. Today I offer a special prayer for our armed forces, our fighters in whom we place our hopes for security, for freedom, for the true independence for our country. Our entire nation needs to wake up today, become alert, understand that the special time has come which might influence the historical fate of our people. This is sermon on April 3rd. Every one of you must know what dangerous events are taking place today in the land of Ukraine. Unquestionably, the enemy of the humankind is provoking the fratricidal war between brothers, members of one church, belonging to the one Orthodox faith. There is nothing more abhorrent, terrible, and disgusting than provoking that fratricidal war. But often enough, people who find themselves under the powerful pressure of propaganda lose their sense of boundaries and fall so completely into the devil's snare that they cannot tell truth from lies and are ready to act as the evil one commands. And now I would like you to pause and think that this is from a sermon which was delivered on Annunciation, Old-style Annunciation, on April 7th, following the official statement by Russian authorities that the killings and atrocities in Bucha were the provocation of the West. Passing on from Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov of Pskov, who is widely rumored to be Putin's confessor and definitely Putin's confidant, says, "We're all asking why our President Vladimir Putin made this difficult decision. Of course, we cannot know all reasons, But from the experience of my relationship with him, I can ascertain that if he didn't see the vital, critical for the Russian people reason to begin this operation, he wouldn't have started it. Some people understand it, some don't. If he hasn't done it now, and in a little while, an attack on Russia would have taken place, an attack leading to many millions of victims, he would have been asked, if this was imminent, why didn't you forestall the trouble? April 9th. And lastly, although I can quote and quote, which is very, very depressing, Metropolitan Sergei of Voronezh. Now, Voronezh is the diocese where a lot of people who are forcibly deported from eastern Ukraine, especially from Mariupol, are being taken. We all must support our president in his endeavor. It is very unfortunate that this task can no longer be accomplished without a bloodshed. Even people in Ukraine understand it, and we receive some of them as refugees. This was said on April 13th. Following the latest quote, I would also like to touch upon the subject of the complicity of the Russian Orthodox Church in the forced resettlements of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees who have been moved to Russia. There are reports, so far unsubstantiated by independent sources for lack of access, of the monasteries and diocesan administrations' active involvement in the separation of families and their relocation to the distant areas in Russia. While the facts in those reports require careful verification, the rhetoric of some of the bishops from the regions bordering Ukraine about the liberation of these refugees from the fascist Ukrainian rule points to, at the very least, their acquiescence to the war crime of kidnapping and resettlement of the civilians from the occupied territories. In conclusion, I would like to state that the facts outlined in my talk, all of them easily accessible in public sources, point out that the sin of prostituting oneself to the worldly power and glory, which time and again is being committed by the Orthodox Church, has an outcome of getting mired in the crimes against humanity. Never does the maxim of the wages of sin is death is more starkly proven as when the Church, in the persons of its hierarchy, clergy, and laity, chooses to stand behind the war of invasion and aggression. And that, of course, shows more brightly the light of those clergy and faithful of the Russian Orthodox Church, who, in spite of significant and ever-increasing personal danger, continue to raise their voices in the opposition to the regime, both state and ecclesial. Thank you.